Hey, this is a little bit of a different video. We're not going to be doing gameplay, but it's going to be an introduction to sort of the concept of team comps in Storybook Brawl, what that means, and a couple of the different factors you want to consider when you're putting yours together. So, first of all, I just wanted to say, what is a team comp? And it's a little bit, unclear in pretty much any game, but especially in this game where you have the interaction of treasures, characters, and hero powers. But I think you can broadly define it as just a combination of treasures, characters, and hero powers that gives your team combat power, often greater power than the sum of its parts. I understand that's very broad, but we're just trying to understand, the sort of subject matter that we're talking about, and I think that's the way to do it. The main factors I usually consider when I'm putting together a team comp is what are the synergies that I'm creating to increase my power level, and what is the scaling I'm achieving in order to carry myself into the late game. So I want to talk about those two factors, and we'll start with synergy. So synergies can arise in a ton of different places in Storybook Brawl. That's a huge part of what makes this game great. And you can get them from characters, you get them from treasures, and you get them from your heroes. Oftentimes your heroes will push you in certain directions in certain comps, and I'll discuss that for specific heroes when we get to those videos. But and treasures can also do the same thing. If you get an early treasure, especially one that's a little more powerful, usually starting with the fives and sixes, they can push you in a specific direction. Although, even I believe the dwarf plus two power is a three, and the dwarf only need two to level, I think, is a 4, as well as I think the Sky Castle, which gives all your princes and princesses plus 4, is a 4-drop treasure, I believe. So those can push you towards a specific comp. If you get those, you might just decide to, you know, pivot your build around that. So, I just want to talk about synergies briefly, just to understand them and, try to get an eye for looking for them within characters. Specific characters, I think there's a little more there than the treasures, but we'll also look at those when we get to the specific videos. So let's look at just 3 characters, and this is Good Boy, Baby Bear, and Bearstein. So between these 3 characters, we have quite a few synergies. First of all, Good Boy, right? It's a good animal. It has this is the upgraded version actually. It has 10-10. Usually it's a 5-5, and when its last breath is when it dies, give you good characters its attack and health. Okay, that's simple enough. So we look at Baby Bear and Berenstein. Those are both good animals. So when Good Boy dies, it will give its attack and health to those 2 characters. That's simple enough, and that's pretty straightforward. That's something you get just from reading the card. However, if we dig a little deeper, let's look at Baby Bear. How does that interact specifically with Good Boy? How is there an added synergy there? Okay, well, obviously it gets the buff, but if we think about Good Boy, one of the risk factors with Good Boy is that if you don't get the first attack, or even if it gets big enough, often you want to pump the Good Boy so it can give more stats to everything. But if it gets big enough that it's not dying on its first attack, you might run into a situation where the rest of your front line gets picked off by the enemy, or even the back line if they have some flying units, and you end up with no good characters for the Good Boy to buff when it dies. However, Baby Bear, when its last breath is when it dies, it summons a 2/2 Papa Bear, and when that one dies, it summons a 4/4 Mama Bear. So what Baby Bear does is it helps mitigate the risk of not having a good character in its slot, because your opponent would have to attack it 3 times to get rid of a good character in that slot for Good Boy to buff. So that's an added synergy. So then if we add in the Bearstein, well, first of all, the obvious one is that both these other characters are animals, so they get the 2/2 buff. But giving 2/2 to Good Boy means that when it dies, it gives that extra 2/2 to all the other good characters. So that's an added synergy there. Now, the Baby Bear is a very good combo with Bearstein because, first of all, it gets +2/+2, and when it dies, the summon gets +2/+2. So that's sort of doubling up on that bonus. However, Bearstein's second ability is when you summon an animal, it doubles its attack and health. So when the Papa Bear and the Mama Bear summon, their attack and health are doubled. So it actually synergizes with Baby Bear in 2 ways. So if you look just between these three characters, there's about a dozen different synergies that emerge. And some of them are, type-based, some of them are alignment-based, some of them are context-based, and some of them are sort of strategic-based. Um, not anything on its face, but the baby bear surviving multiple hits means that the strategy of letting your good boy buff all your characters it comes to fruition more often. So that's just sort of a brief example of some synergies, and the specific ones, again, we'll talk about in the other videos. But I think you can see that there's a huge amount of strategic, space to cover with different characters in this game, and that's not even counting the treasures and hero powers, which add just another element. The second thing we want to talk about is scaling. So throughout the game, obviously, your goal is to make your board stronger. And the overall concept of that is something we'll call scaling. And it can happen because of, just static text like Prince Arthur. If you have upgraded princes or princesses, they get +2/+2. That's just a standard scaling. It will happen every round. You can have something like Lancelot. When it slays, it gets +2/+2. And when it's upgraded, it'll be +4/+4. You can imagine that that could be quite big, and you can increase that if you have treasures that let your slay characters attack twice. Lancelot might get extra attacks. If you have a Baba Yaga, which doubles all your slay abilities, Lancelot can, get double that, and it can get quite big over time. And it will continue to increase in strength throughout the game. So scaling is just how do we reach a point where in the late game our power level is higher than it is earlier in the game, and because our opponents are going to, because as you get higher level characters, when the 5s and 6s are generally stronger than 3s and 4s, stronger than 2s. So if you have, characters in the early game, you either need to replace them all with higher level characters, or you need a way for that character to grow in stats overall, or just continue to have usefulness. Some characters, like Cupid and Medusa, can scale in sort of a pseudo-scaling way by eliminating the scaling of your opponent. So a 3/3 Medusa can attack into an 100/100 the same way it attacks into a 10/10 because it transforms it into a statue. And a Cupid causes your opponents to attack each other, so the power of that attack actually scales off your opponent's characters. So you can sort of, subvert the scaling paradigm that way. But in general, we're looking for different ways that we can get our characters to increase in strength over time. And, some characters will do that in a permanent way, like the Lancelot or the Prince Arthur, the Storm King here. But some will just do that in a fight, like a good boy can make your board quite strong, but it will only be for that fight. And often that will be big enough to win in the late game. However, it's possible that your opponent can surpass that. And if they do, the continued fights will not go in your favor because you are not gaining any strength fight to fight. So that's something to note. There's scaling sort of within a given fight and just within the broader context of the game. And those are the two things that we want to talk about in regards to team comp. One thing that I wanted to say, and this is specifically about synergies, is that synergies are meant to produce power. They aren't in themselves powerful, and you don't want to try to maximize synergies or scaling even at the expense of your board. The point of putting a baby bear and a Berenstein together is to be a powerful character. But if you instead had just 100/100 Storm King, that might be a better character to put alongside a baby bear than the Berenstein would, because it just provides more stats overall. Trying to maximize your synergies is good if it makes your board more powerful, but it's not an end goal by itself. Early game, you often see this with something like Fanny. If you have a dwarf to put in front of Fanny, it gets +2/+2. +2/+2 is a reasonable buff early game. However, the early game dwarfs aren't usually that great. There's a crafty that's just a 1/1. So if you put it in front of a Fanny, it's a 3/3, and that's fine. Early game, the average stats are right around 2/2. So, 3/3 is bigger than that. However, if you, level up to 2 and you see a character that's, strength 4/4 even, or, sorry, you level up to level 3. So say you see something like a Romeo. Romeo's a 5/3. And if you put a Romeo in front of Fanny, it doesn't get a buff, but it's a 5/3 in terms of power. And if you put a Crafty in front of the Fanny, it does get the buff, but it just turns into a 3/3. And that's sort of the end of it. When we evaluate the power level of different options, we want to look at just what the net power level is, not sort of the mechanism for how that's created, because we don't want to get too attached to the idea that we need to maximize the power of our individual units by utilizing them in the best way. We want to see how we can maximize the power of our board by utilizing the units we have available. So that's the sort of my little spiel on synergy. The other thing is with scaling. One of the balance points you're going to strike throughout the game is finding a way to figure out when you can take weaker units that will scale over time, and when you can, try to craft a board that produces long-term power, or when you need to just put as many stats on the board as possible, but you sort of risk running into a local maximum of power, and eventually you're going to get outscaled yourself. This will often happen with evil comps, tend to be on the weaker side in the late game. So if you go an evil comp, maybe you got something like a sarcophagus, or maybe you just have an evil queen, or just some strong evil characters. Medusas, apple bombs can all be very strong, and maybe you get those in the mid game, and you're going with those. And at some point you make the decision: do I want to start shifting to other characters? Maybe you see a Lancelot available. Do I want to switch to a Lancelot, and my board will become a little weaker, but it will help me develop some power to ultimately try to take down the lobby later in the game? Or do I want to stay in this area because maybe I'm low on health? Maybe I can't afford to take turns off building up power. And the same is true if you talk about something like buying XP. You can buy XP if you're, relatively strong, and maybe if you're weaker, you need to do it to try to get out ahead of people. But if you end up with 0 HP, it doesn't matter what level you're at. So that's another consideration. So in the later videos, we're going to try to get into the specific comps, and I think we'll have a lot of better examples laid out in those ones, the ones I've done so far. I think that this all becomes a little clearer. If you're interested in hearing those, make sure to subscribe, and those will be coming in the next couple of days. I appreciate you listening. Thank you.